Dear Earthmates, today we are visiting Atsuhide Ito, uh, and he's an environmentalist, artist, and scholar. And thank you so much for accepting this invitation for the interview, dear new friend. Um, um, how long have you been in England?
I have been in England for over 30 years now.
Mhm. Yes, and I came. I wanted to contact you because I read your wonderful article on air politics. Um, uh, would you kindly mention that to begin with, and then we can mention other points.
Okay, so um, first of all, um, when I first wrote the short article, I was really concerned with inequality, which is manifesting during the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. And obviously, there were three key news items which really triggered and concerned me. Of course, the uh, now well-known incident of George Floyd's case, but also the migrants who are traveling from the European continent to the English border. They were contained in the back of a lorry and then they suffocated. And also the case of a young person who living in South London and whose lungs collapse numerous times due to air pollution. And then these three sort of news items really pointed to me that there was something invisible, but at the same time, though, these invisible violence needed to be made visible or at least to be discussed. So I began to um, um, write a very short article at the time, and then now it's um, uh, extended into a larger book chapter that I'm sort of trying to finish now, called Aeropolitics, Politics and Poetics of Breathing. So, yeah, in a way that it's really about, at the time, I think especially during the lockdown, um, that was induced by COVID-19 pandemic, um, there was something about politics of air and breathing. That one point about air and breathing is that air and breathing, well, air seems to be everywhere, and then it's accessed by everyone, including non-human persons as well. At the same time, though, when you look at these three cases mentioned earlier, of course, access to air is not equal, so that we tend to think requirement for breathing is universal and fundamental. Therefore, that we tend to think it's something taken for granted. But actually, during the COVID-19, also that you have heard that the rich has traveled to a countryside or were able to afford properties in islands and so on and so forth, while others had a very different circumstances. And so that's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up this notion of aeropolitics. Of course, that's very much inspired or by the scholar Michel Foucault's notion of biopolitics, which is to manage state and authorities to manage lives of populace. But then also following Michel Foucault, Academy members' notion of necropolitics, which is about management of death or authorities are able to determine whose lives are worth saving and others are potentially be discarded. So taking these two terms, I wanted to think about politics of air and then how inequality is made invisible, but actually that's something needed to be made visible. So I think thinking about that, I also thought, since I have been involved in art, in the arts, and my background is I have studied social anthropology and fine art, and then I teach mainly fine art courses at the moment. And then that really, through teaching, also that made me think that what is the role of art? Of course, in this, of course, artists and art can do something to make people aware by disrupting every day, as in some environmental protests which are going on currently. But also there are different approaches which are more slower and then restorative approaches that are about making tiny efforts to really challenge legislation and laws and so on and so forth. So I've been thinking about these things, but at the same time, though, I thought more about spaces of art, how art object becomes something valuable, and then how that space is made elevated against everyday space. So in a way, to put it really simply, and a slightly crude argument, but art is about making art spaces elevated against other spaces. So in a way that art is also complicit, or at least implicitly responsible for creating this hierarchy between one space against another. And then that is also something really invisible. So I wanted to really think about that. And then how seemingly independent activity called art is also complicit in creating hierarchies of being. So that's another thought. And I think another line that is addressed in the short article, but also that something I have extended recently in another piece of writing, is the weaponization of air as well. So that's I did mention that following the scholar Peter Sloterdijk, there was sort of gas used in the First World War. And then, of course, it's not about soldier aiming at an enemy and shooting the person in the enemy line, so that the soldier would feel responsible for or accountable for each action he takes. But if you put a gas or sarin gas or something like that, which took place in, for instance, Tokyo sarin attack, for instance. So it's an anonymous attack on anonymous civilians. So it's about attack on the atmosphere that is has really changed since the First World War. And so in a way that this weaponization of air is consistent throughout the 20th century, and then that collide, if you like, with the inequality between beings and persons, which are entrapped in different atmospheric field. And so that's something that I thought that needs to be really addressed, this kind of collision of history of weaponization of air. And then on the other hand, inequality, which has been really linked to violence, which comes through the politics of air. So that these are the kind of key points I wanted to make. And of course, in extension, I had thought of sense of immunity as well, that how we think of breathing as something codependent with others, in a way that, especially this is a really contentious kind of issue, but when you're breathing, of course we need to breathe, but then sometimes we are unsympathetic, or we have no understanding of how others are not able to have access to air, and then how they suffer, but we are ignorant because it's not the same experience we can share, but actually others are struggling to um, gain the rhythm of breath, and then how important that is to understand that. Partly because my brother has suffered from asthma, and then I have sort of personal experience of not understanding or not sort of having empathy for him when I was small. So that really coming from that, but in extension, it's breathing, especially when COVID was rampant. Of course, the fact that you can infect others while you can be infected. So in a way, this codependency, or where is the immunity stands in a way, where's the boundary between self and others or non-self? How do we understand that? I think that has been another sort of key um, point, and how actually this sense of boundary around oneself, how that has been actually traditionally, even going back to Niels Jerne, who used the word immunity for the first time, or more recently, someone, Eula Biss, who wrote about immunity. They really come to the notion that actually self is something more complex than something like a closed self against others, but it's actually it's a lot more complex kind of relationship, and then how breathing and politics of air, or air politics, allows us to think about codependency or interdependency of breathing. And then that's another sort of point that I have thought about for actually quite a long time.
Sorry, wonderful. Um, I am, of course, grateful to you because of your focusing on vital issues. And air, water, earth, and fire, traditionally, they've been considered the main elements, and how true that is.
Mm.
If we use the word energy for fire, we still have the basic elements. And um, one of the things I would like to say is talking about wars, as I was listening to you.
Mm.
Uh, words are important, and unfortunately, uh, in history books or in media, we see, for example, let's say about 50 million people died in World War II.
Mm.
Now, this is wrong. 50 million people did not die. 50 million people were killed in World
Mm.
War.
Mm.
We should use were killed instead of died, because maybe 100 million people died and 50 million were from other reasons. That's
Mm.
one of the things. Secondly, as you mentioned, non-human persons also are killed. So
Mm.
why only give numbers limited to human beings? So we can say that uh, at least 100 million lives were killed in World War II. So many horses, cats, dogs, flies, birds, trees, etc. So we should rephrase this war expressions, I think. Um, and air politics, um, uh, I would like to share something else with you. For a long time, I asked myself, what kind of a global organization is necessary, in addition to the wonderful local and international organizations. And after research, discussions, thinking, I came to a simple solution. It should be like air. The organization should be like air. does air have a structure? Well, yes and no. So instead of trying to form an independent, different, official, formal organization, how about encouraging multidisciplinary, multi-continental, multi-generational friendships concerned with this infinity of dimensions, and people who can trust one another. And then this is something we cannot. So air politics, in a way, maybe one side is attached to this notion, maybe attached. I just wanted to share, and we, in another episode, I would like to, and you're always welcome to join whenever you have time, feel like it. Join our monthly 1.5 hour meetings, Earthmates from various countries and professions. In the old symposium mentality, expressing whatever you wish to share, and especially when it is difficult to follow up. Dominant media exclude certain things, but we can learn from our friend in Nigeria or in Pakistan what's really going on there and how they've been dealing with certain issues. So I just, sorry for this parentheses. How about your artwork? Would you like to say a few things about your...
Well, first of all, I just respond to some of the things you have just mentioned. I suppose, another point I have implicitly pointed out was also a legal side of the problem of air politics as well. So that's something that since I work in the area of art and a little bit in social sciences, so it's not really my area of specialization. But I suppose, for instance, when you say asphyxial murder, so that somebody strangles somebody else, for instance, that's clearly a crime. But then in other more collective cases in which some victims, both victims, really suffer from lack of air, that's really systemic and structural, then isn't that somebody should be accountable? So that's another sort of point that I wanted to really bring out. That's really an elusive problem. And then legally, probably it's an elusive issue. But at the same time, though, I think it's really important. If somebody strangles somebody else and then the victim suffers from it, then what about in the cases in which collectively lack of air, access to air, or toxication of air becomes a cause for suffering? Isn't that going to be a more clear legal framework that can be brought forward? That's another point that I have thought of. In terms of art practice, I think it's I have been attempting to think about and making and planning works about breathing, partly. And so in a way that in art, for instance, breathing is related to almost like a magical spell. In art, we use the word aura traditionally. That's a slightly sort of outdated word, but what it means is that the work by the labor of the artist, the artwork on object, let's say painting or installation, or could be a sculpture or performance even, that can be elevated to become something like a enigmatic object. So in a way that I've been thinking about using breathing as simple as possible in a way to produce work. But also I've been looking into uses of sensors as well. So air pollution sensor as well to sort of, in a way, make something invisible visible. That's really one of the key things about art, I suppose. So that when air seemingly clean or not necessarily detected by human body as harmful, then how do you let us understand that is something problematic? So in a way that that kind of invisible violence, Rob Nixon uses the word slow violence, but I suppose, that's how do you visualize, how, in other words, how do we know um, violence which you can't even feel, you can't even know, can be knowable? So that's, I think, one of the things that art can do. And also that in regards to what you said earlier, I suppose there's a kind of incredible range of stratification in spaces when you look at it globally. Of course, maybe it's for me to say such a thing is really, really too ambitious, I suppose. But since my kind of interest in air politics really began when I became interested in the nuclear accident in Fukushima earlier in 2011. So again, radiation is invisible and it doesn't have an odor. It doesn't have any other humanly detectable characteristics unless you get ill because of the strong radiation coming to you. So in a way that it's really about art functioning to make something visible that is initially invisible or unknowable into the sphere of known. And so in a way, that is coinciding, or that's kind of aligned with history of nuclearity in the 20th century, where, for instance, in Central Asia or oceanic nations, for instance, these spaces are understood as almost like empty blank slate, and then violence was exercised on these places. So in a way, there's a hierarchy is also something to do with hierarchy between metropolis and sort of traditionally sort of marginal sort of geographical areas. And then I think a lot of these points have been illustrated or not embodied, if you like, or kind of made visible by a lot of artworks. And then I think my artwork hopefully contributes to that sort of a range of really diverse and rich range of artist effort made to make imperceptible violence visible. And yeah, I hope I can contribute to that to a minor degree.
Yes, and an idea, you have brought an idea to me. I will keep it secret for now, but it will be a short theatrical stuff, and I will dedicate it to you.
Oh, sounds great.
Breathing. I recall my school years. We used to have physical education, but nobody said anything about the art of breathing.
Mm.
Even probably in theater schools they do that, but I mean, sometimes I love this expression, back to the basics.
Mm.
In philosophy, of course, from age to age, we need that. But just like Socrates used to ask, what is honor, what is thought, what is knowledge? Today, we also need to look at the basics and ask these questions, elementary questions, and invite the schools, why not focus on the basics of life? Why don't we? What I studied biology, but it was so boring because it was not related to life. Ironically, I mean, so we can ask the governments, UNESCO, UNICEF, to add vital pieces of information, education, and to our lives, actually. Your website is very exciting, of course. I will visit your website again. And were you born in Japan?
Yeah, I was born in Japan, and I did study anthropology and fine art in the UK, but yeah, I have thought of different kind of educational systems, but also maybe breathing in Japan has been very important, I suppose, in maybe slightly different way of understanding breathing from duration of time I've been living here. But I don't know, I can't really articulate it, but I suppose one point is that, as I said earlier, that breathing is a very specific individual event. And there's even a work by someone called Smith and Stewart, and it's really almost like a really intimidating or threatening sense that you get provoked. But in the work, for instance, there's a person who is breathing in a plastic bag, and then you could imagine that this person cannot really see much. There's such a small space in which that person is breathing in, and this claustrophobia. So that the work makes you feel that this person must be struggling to breathe. So that allows you to have some kind of empathy for the person, but also that the work illustrates that although the need for it is universal, but then there's a kind of individuated experience of breathing. And then I think that really coming through some of the artwork, such as Smith and Stewart work as well. And yeah, I think that's another thing, I wanted to point out. And also, I think that, but I think there's a tendency to generalize that breathing is a kind of existentialist kind of exercise or kind of understanding. But I think it's also, I think the point is that I want to emphasize, despite the need for, it's almost like a breathing as an ontological, general kind of necessity, but at the same time, this differentiated experiences, individuated experiences, also to have an empathy for it is also very important. I think that's, I just wanted to really stress. Yeah. And I wanted to say something, but I can't remember, so I just, yeah.
Your mind is full, and the traffic is always, condensed. What would you like to recommend to young Earthmates?
I suppose it's really about trying to understand others, but also to put it in, as you mentioned education earlier, it's really to put it really quite simply, learning. I think how important it is to learn, and then in a way to understand so many people in the past also, despite the fact that for young people, you can say that grown-ups, including myself, has been responsible for the environmental or even air pollution and so on and so forth. And that is very true. But at the same time, though, there are so many others, unaccountable others who have made small contributions here and there, and then their works haven't been known, but they made little contributions and how important they are. So when you look at the history of concerns about air, and which, for instance, even starting from, as you mentioned earlier about the Greeks. So even if you go back to the Greek civilization, Hippocrates talked about miasma, meaning bad air, quite simply. But what you breathe is who you are as well. So in a way that it's not just you are not contained in the body, but also you are enwrapped in the air, and then what you breathe is part of you. And then that's shared with others. So concerns for others really absolutely significant and important, but also to recognize the little efforts people have made. And then that's really important to recognize. So in a way, how important it is to learn, and then the efforts of others, and then the experiences of others. I think that's really crucial.
True. In Turkish, there is an expression, an idiom, havadan sudan konuşmak, to talk about air and water, but meaning unimportant stuff. But this is ironic because they are among the most important topics. So we need to talk more about air and water.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's strange how language needs to change regarding consciousness, etc. And what are you working on these days? I mean, in addition to
Well, one big question is, how do you respond to the ecological crisis, and what are the artistic research and strategies to be able to respond to the situations? I think that's really the key. So in my writing, I'm finishing the extended article about air politics, and also another strand of my work is about the history of nuclear culture, and then how to understand it. So that's another part of my writing. And in terms of making artwork, I've been trained as a painter. So I've been painting, and then that's a very different kind of process. It's almost leads me anywhere and everywhere. And even if I try to work with certain themes, it doesn't let me just do it. It just goes somewhere else. And then so I'm sort of enjoying that sort of creative process. But also I'm using quite simply breathing, and also air sensors and radiation sensors, and how they could have some kind of sense of understanding that could be turned into some kind of aesthetic or artistic experience for the viewers and audiences. So these are the kind of areas of work I've been involved in.
Wonderful. In your life, you have fruitfully combined art, science, education, and activism. You're a great example, good example. And I'm so happy, excited, joyful to have met you. Is there anything else you would like to add before we put a comma?
I suppose, I think, especially I think art is something traditionally, something very much understood as a solitary individual activity. Then I think I value that for sure. But at the same time, though, I think it's more urgent need to be able to talk to each other, and have understanding with each other to respond to this enormous task of responding to the situations at the moment. So I think it's important to, quite simply, we should be probably continue to talk.
Yes, one of my favorite concepts is synergy. I love that. And well, I hope we can have more and more interactions. And thank you so much for your wonderful living, breathing, living, being fruitful. And we're together.
Yes, thank you so much.
I enjoy saying this at the end of whatever it is. We are together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes. See you.
Bye. See you soon.
See you.